Why had her smile vanished the moment she reached his table? Thomas Ward noticed it instantly, the way the young waitress softened her voice for the trucker by the window, how she laughed quietly with the elderly couple near the counter. But when she turned to him, her eyes hardened, her tone clipped like a blade. It was subtle but unmistakable. She didn't want him here, and he couldn't figure out why. The plate in front of him was still steaming. Bacon, eggs, toast. Food he'd ordered out of routine rather than hunger. He had been coming to this diner for years, always alone, always with the same quiet ritual, corner seat, black coffee, meal untouched. It wasn't that he couldn't eat, it was that he couldn't taste. Somewhere, years ago, taste had been burned out of him, smothered by desert dust and acrid smoke. Today was supposed to be no different. He had planned to eat in silence, pay in silence, leave in silence. But this morning, the silence felt heavier than usual, as if it carried judgment instead of peace. He caught himself shifting in his seat, the leather creaking under his weight, the weight of memories he carried. Thomas had learned to endure cold looks from strangers. Veterans often did. People didn't understand what years of service etched into your face. They didn't see the shadows that followed you home. But the waitress, she couldn't have been more than 22. Too young to look at him with that kind of edge, and that cut deeper than he wanted to admit. So he pushed his chair back, decided to leave before he made a fool of himself by asking why. He had learned long ago not to demand explanations from the world. It gave none. His boots scraped against the worn linoleum, the familiar sound of worn leather groaning as he rose. He was ready to walk out. And then he saw it. Just a glimpse at first, no more than a shadow of ink peeking from beneath the cuff of her sleeve. But it stopped him like a sudden shot in the dark. He froze, hand gripping the back of the chair. His chest tightened. His breath stilled. Dog tags. He knew the outline instantly, the way only a soldier would. Two tags hanging together, etched into her skin like a promise. Beside them, a series of numbers, precise, deliberate, not random, never random. He sat back down, hard. The room shifted. The diner's chatter blurred, voices melting into a distant hum. He could still see lips moving, plates clattering, forks scraping, but none of it reached him. The only thing that mattered was the ink beneath her sleeve. Thomas had carried silence for years. It was his armor, his punishment, his shield. The war had left him with more than a limp in his right leg, more than scars hidden beneath his shirt. It had left him with memories that refused to die, a name that echoed every night, a promise whispered to a grave. Corporal Daniel Price. The numbers on her arm, they were a date, that date. He blinked, and suddenly he was no longer in the diner. The smell hit him first. Burnt rubber, diesel, sand. The sharp sting of smoke crawling down his throat. The landscape around him was washed in yellow dust, the sun a merciless weight overhead. He could hear the frantic calls over the radio, the low whine of a chopper circling far too late. And beneath it all, the steady, slowing breaths of the man he had dragged behind cover. Daniel. Thomas's throat closed. He clenched his fists on the table, nails digging into calloused palms until it hurt. He remembered the numbers carved into that tattoo because he had lived them. He had knelt in the dirt that day. He had pressed his hands against a wound too deep to close. He had begged for one more minute, one more breath. He had promised. God, he had promised. He had promised to look after Daniel's family. And now, without warning, without explanation, the promise was standing across the diner, pouring coffee into strangers' cups. The waitress moved quickly between tables, her shoulders squared, her eyes darting to him only to flick away. She was nervous, defensive. She wore that edge-like armor. He knew that look. He had worn it himself for years. That was the look of someone who trusted no one because trust had already betrayed them. He didn't call her over. Not yet. He just sat there, staring at his cold coffee, fighting the tremor in his hands. People noticed, of course. A veteran staring at a waitress a little too long. Bystanders gave sidelong glances, but no one intervened. That's the thing about silence. It lets misunderstandings fester. It allows cruelty to hide beneath civility. When she finally returned to his table, notepad in hand, her sleeve slipped just enough. The ink revealed itself fully now. Dog tags, the date, and beneath them a name. Daniel Price. It hit him like a bullet. No warning, no mercy, just impact. Thomas swallowed hard. He felt the weight of years pressing down on him, the sound of rain at a graveside, the echo of his own voice when he saluted and whispered into the earth, "I'll look after them. I swear it." The waitress, Daniel's family, was right here. But she didn't know him, not yet. His first instinct was to tell her, to explain everything, to reach across the table and say, "I was there. I knew him. I carried him." But the words caught in his throat. Sometimes the truth was too heavy to put into words, and sometimes silence carried more dignity than explanations ever could. So instead he reached into his pocket. His fingers brushed against leather worn thin with years of use. Inside, tucked behind an old photograph, was something he had never parted with: Daniel's challenge coin. He had kept it all these years, through deployments, through sleepless nights, through the long, empty mornings at this very diner. It had been his anchor, his quiet reminder of the man who had trusted him with more than a mission. Thomas placed the coin on the table. The clink was soft, almost swallowed by the room, but it cut through everything for her. The waitress stopped. Her eyes fell on the coin, and her hand, steady, defensive, hardened, trembled. She looked at him then, really looked, and in that moment the coldness was gone. No questions, no explanations, just recognition. Her lips parted, but no words came. She blinked back tears, one hand unconsciously moving to cover the tattoo on her arm, as if shielding it, as if grounding herself in the ink that carried so much weight. Thomas didn't speak. He didn't need to. He had learned that sometimes the loudest truths are the ones spoken in silence. The rest of the diner went on unaware. Forks clinked, conversations hummed. The world turned. For them, the war had ended years ago. But at this table, between a weary veteran and a young woman with a tattoo, the battle for memory and respect had just begun. When Thomas finally rose to leave again, he moved slower this time. Not because of his limp, but because of the heaviness in his chest. She met him at the door, didn't speak, didn't ask, just placed her hand over her tattoo and gave the smallest of nods. And for him, that was enough. Because sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts. Why hadn't he said anything to her? That question followed Thomas long after he stepped out into the parking lot. The morning air was crisp, carrying the faint smell of gasoline from the highway. His boots scuffed against gravel as he moved toward his truck, but his mind was still inside the diner. He could see her face, the way her expression had shifted when she saw the coin, that crack in her armor, sudden and unguarded. He had seen soldiers break before, but this was different. This wasn't battle fatigue or the hollow stare of a man too long in the fight. This was something quieter, the weight of absence, the ache of carrying love for someone who would never walk through the door again. He should have told her, he should have said, "I was there. I tried to save him. I failed." But the words had lodged in his throat, refusing to come out. Maybe because he knew the truth wouldn't set her free. It hadn't set him free either. Thomas leaned against the hood of his truck and lit a cigarette, the flare of the lighter illuminating the scars across his knuckles. He hadn't smoked in months, but tonight he needed the burn, needed the silence that came with the exhale. The diner door opened behind him, and for one reckless heartbeat he thought she might follow, that she might demand answers or at least ask his name. But it wasn't her. Just another customer leaving, keys jingling, laughter echoing faintly before being swallowed by the road. He climbed into the cab, the seat groaning under his weight. The coin still glimmered in his mind, though it sat back inside his wallet now. He couldn't forget the look on her face when she recognized it. Not recognition of him, she hadn't known him, but recognition of Daniel. recognition of the bond soldiers carried with them, etched not into skin or stone, but into the marrow of memory. He started the engine. The radio came alive with static before settling into a low hum of country music, but he turned it off. He didn't need sound. His own mind was loud enough. As the miles stretched before him, he found himself pulled back to the desert, to that day, the day that had marked her skin and his soul. He hadn't told anyone about the last words Daniel spoke, maybe because they weren't words meant for him, maybe because repeating them felt like stealing. But now, with the waitress's eyes fresh in his memory, he could hear them clearly. "Tell her, tell my sister." The rest had been swallowed by blood and dust, words unfinished. Thomas had leaned in closer, straining to catch them, but by then it was too late. The chopper was overhead, the medics yelling, his own hands pressing against a wound that wouldn't stop bleeding. And Daniel was gone. Thomas gripped the steering wheel. The waitress wasn't just Daniel's family. She was the unfinished sentence, the message that never made it home. He cursed under his breath and pulled the truck over, gravel spitting beneath the tires. His heart was hammering now, the same way it used to when he knew a mission had gone sideways. He sat there, engine idling, cigarette burning down in the ashtray. Should he go back? What would he even say? He imagined walking back into that diner, the bell above the door jingling, her eyes widening when she saw him again. He would sit down, steady his voice, and tell her everything. About Daniel's courage, about the way he never hesitated to put others first, about the moment he fell and the promise Thomas had whispered through clenched teeth. But then what? Would it heal her? Or would it reopen wounds she had tried desperately to stitch closed? The hardest truth of war wasn't that soldiers died. It was that their stories often died with them, left incomplete, left for others to carry like broken shards, cutting deeper the longer you held them. Thomas slammed the truck back into gear and drove on. Maybe it was cowardice. Maybe it was mercy. He wasn't sure anymore. All he knew was that silence felt safer for both of them. But silence never lasts. 2 nights later, he found himself outside the diner again. He hadn't planned it. He told himself he was just passing through, that the empty stretch of highway had pulled him back by coincidence. But when he saw the glow of neon in the windows, he slowed down, parked in the same spot, and sat there for a long while before going in. She was there, wiping down tables near the counter, hair tied back, eyes tired in a way that went deeper than her age. She didn't see him at first, and when she finally did, her whole body stiffened. Not with anger, not with fear, just with a kind of bracing, as if she were preparing for something heavy to fall. He slid into the same corner booth. The routine felt ritualistic now, like he had no choice. When she came over, she didn't ask what he wanted. She just poured coffee into his cup and stood there, silent, waiting. Thomas studied her carefully. She had Daniel's eyes, not the color, not exactly, but the way they held things. Quiet strength, quiet pain. He wanted to say something, anything. Instead, he reached into his pocket again. This time not the coin, a photograph. It was worn, edges frayed, the colors fading after years, tucked inside his wallet. A group of men in dusty uniforms, arms slung over each other's shoulders. And in the center, Daniel. The waitress froze. Her hand hovered above the table, as if reaching for the picture but afraid to touch it. Where did you get this?" she asked, her voice fragile for the first time. Thomas cleared his throat. The words felt like gravel. "He was my brother out there." She swallowed hard, eyes locked on the photo. "He was my brother here." The silence that followed was heavy, but not empty. It was filled with all the things neither of them had dared to say. Her hand finally moved, brushing the edge of the photograph. She didn't ask who Thomas was or why he had carried this for so long. She didn't need to. Some truths are obvious without explanation. Thomas leaned back, feeling the weight of years press against his chest. He thought of Daniel's unfinished words, the message that had never reached her. Should he say it now? Should he tell her? He opened his mouth, then closed it again. Some things still weren't ready. For now all he could offer was presence. And maybe, for the first time in years, presence was enough. The diner bustled around them, unaware of the quiet storm brewing in one corner booth. Two lives, bound by the same ghost, sitting across from each other with only silence and coffee between them. And in that silence, something fragile began to shift. Because sometimes, the deepest connections aren't born from words at all, but from the space between them. Why did memories come back sharper at night? Thomas lay in bed, the ceiling fan creaking overhead, but his mind was nowhere near the four walls of his apartment. It was back in the desert, under a sky so wide it felt like it could crush you. Back to the heat that never eased, the dust that clung to your lungs, and the sound of boots moving in rhythm like a heartbeat. He hadn't wanted to remember. For years he fought it back, drowned it with whiskey, silenced it with cigarettes, buried it beneath the mechanical routine of waking, working, sleeping. But after seeing Daniel's sister again, after seeing the tattoo, the coin, the look in her eyes, he couldn't stop it anymore. The past had claws, and it was dragging him back. He remembered the mission as if it were yesterday. It was supposed to be simple. Nothing ever is, but that's what Command had said. In and out, quick. They had been tasked with clearing a village rumored to harbor weapons caches. Thomas had heard that phrase before countless times. Weapons cache. It was almost a joke, a code word for the unknown. Sometimes you found rifles stacked in mud huts. Sometimes you found nothing but families trying to survive. And sometimes you found both. They had moved in just after dawn, the light barely cresting the horizon, shadows long and stretched across the sand. Daniel was to his left, always to his left. That was their formation. The kid had been solid, dependable, carrying himself with a steadiness beyond his years. He wasn't reckless, but he wasn't timid either. Just steady. The kind of man you wanted beside you when things went bad. Thomas could still hear the crunch of their boots, the faint hum of a drone somewhere high above. They passed doorways darkened by suspicion, children peeking out from behind mothers, men watching silently from rooftops. The village was alive but muted, holding its breath. That should have been the first warning. "Eyes up," Daniel had muttered, voice low but calm. And then it happened. The blast tore the morning apart. A roar of fire and smoke erupted from the ground ahead, a flash that swallowed everything. Thomas felt the force slam into him, throwing him down into the dirt. His ears rang, vision blurred, heart hammering against his ribs. The world was chaos, screams, gunfire, dust choking the air. When he staggered to his feet, Daniel was already moving, already pulling men to cover, shouting orders through the smoke. He wasn't the ranking officer, but in that moment, rank didn't matter. He was the one everyone looked to. Thomas saw him dart forward, toward a young private pinned by debris, gunfire snapping around them. He saw him drag the kid free, shoving him toward safety. And then he saw the round hit Daniel. It was a small movement, almost imperceptible. A jerk in his step, a falter in his stance. But Thomas knew. He knew instantly. He sprinted, every instinct firing, every muscle straining. By the time he reached him, Daniel was already down. Blood pooled fast, too fast, staining the sand a dark, unforgiving red. "Stay with me," Thomas had yelled, dropping to his knees, pressing his hands hard against the wound. "Stay with me, damn it." Daniel's eyes had locked on his, calm, too calm. And then the words, broken, fragmented, "Tell her, tell my sister." The rest had been lost in a gurgle of blood, his voice swallowed by the chaos. Thomas had screamed for a medic, but the gunfire was relentless. He dragged Daniel behind cover, his own body shielding him. But he knew. He knew the moment he felt the life leaving him, slipping through his fingers no matter how hard he pressed. Daniel's hand had gone slack in his eyes, still open, staring past him into a sky that would never change for him again. Thomas had sat there, shaking, the world collapsing around him. He didn't remember the rest of the firefight, didn't remember how they got out. He only remembered the silence after, the silence heavier than any explosion, the silence that had followed him home. Thomas rolled over in bed, heart racing, sweat dampening his shirt. He sat up, pressing his palms into his eyes. He had carried that moment for years, carried Daniel's unfinished words like a weight strapped to his chest. And now, seeing his sister, seeing her wearing Daniel's name on her skin, made the weight unbearable. He couldn't sleep, so he drove. The diner was quiet at this hour, half the lights off, the hum of the fridge louder than the murmur of the few late-night customers. She was there, of course, always there. He wondered if she ever left. She glanced up when the bell over the door chimed. Her eyes widened just slightly before narrowing again, a wall snapping back into place. He slid into his booth. She approached slowly, notebook in hand, though she didn't bother writing anything. "You're back," she said flatly. "Yeah," Thomas replied, voice low. She poured his coffee without asking. The steam rose between them like a fragile veil. They sat in silence for a while, the kind of silence that wasn't empty but loaded, heavy with the things unsaid. He could feel her watching him from the corner of her eye, cautious, curious, maybe even angry. Finally she broke it. "You knew him." Thomas's throat tightened. He nodded. "My brother," she added, as if daring him to deny it. "Yeah," he whispered, "your brother." Her eyes flickered. For a moment he saw something break through, the same steadiness Daniel had, the same strength wrapped around something fragile. She set the coffee pot down hard, too hard, liquid sloshing over the rim of his cup. "Nobody talks about him. Not my mom, not my dad. They act like if they don't say his name, maybe the pain won't exist. But it does, every damn day." Thomas clenched his jaw. He knew that kind of silence. The silence of families too broken to face the hole left behind. "He talked about you," Thomas said suddenly, surprising even himself. Her eyes snapped to his. "What?" "In the field he mentioned you, once, called you stubborn." Her breath hitched, a sound caught between a laugh and a sob. "That sounds like him." Thomas stared into his coffee. He wanted to tell her everything, the way Daniel had led, the way he had cared, the way his last words had been for her. But the words stuck. Not yet. Not tonight. Instead, he slid the photograph across the table again. She picked it up, studying every face, her finger hovering over Daniel's smile. "He looked so alive," she whispered. Thomas's chest ached. He was. The silence returned, but this time it was softer. Not empty, not cruel, just heavy with grief shared between two people who had carried it alone for too long. For the first time in years, Thomas felt something shift inside him. The burden didn't vanish. It never would. But it felt lighter just slightly, knowing Daniel's memory wasn't his alone to bear. And across from him, Daniel's sister blinked back tears and whispered words that struck him harder than any bullet ever had. "Thank you for remembering him." Thomas nodded, unable to speak, because remembering was all he had left. Why was she still here, in this small-town diner, when the rest of the world had moved on? She asked herself that almost every night, standing behind the counter, rag in hand, wiping the same spot until the surface shone. She wondered if she was trapped or if she had chosen this cage for herself. Maybe both. The waitress, Daniel's sister, though Thomas still didn't know her first name, hadn't planned this life. She hadn't planned much of anything, really. She had been in college when her brother left for his last deployment. Business major, second year, juggling night classes and a part-time job at the bookstore. The world felt wide open back then, full of roads she could take. And then came the knock on the door. She still remembered the way her mother crumpled, a sound leaving her throat that didn't even seem human. She remembered her father's silence, the way he pressed his hand against the wall to steady himself, eyes hollow. She remembered the uniforms standing on their porch, hats in their hands, voices careful and flat, as if speaking too softly could soften the truth. Corporal Daniel Price, killed in action. She had wanted to scream, wanted to demand they take the words back, to insist they had the wrong house, the wrong name, but she couldn't. She had just stood there, numb, her body locking around the one fact that shattered everything. Her brother wasn't coming home. Grief is strange. It doesn't come all at once. It comes in waves. Some days she could breathe, almost live, almost pretend. Other days, the smallest thing, a song on the radio, a folded shirt in the laundry, would send her spiraling, clutching the bathroom sink just to stay upright. Her parents retreated into their own silence. Her father worked longer hours. Her mother stared at the TV for days without speaking. The house grew quieter, heavier, until she couldn't stand it anymore. So she left. She dropped out of school, packed a duffel, and took the first job she could find, waiting tables in a roadside diner. It wasn't much, but it was steady. It gave her structure, a reason to get out of bed. And in a way, it felt like penance. Every plate she carried, every rude customer she smiled through, every late shift she dragged herself into, it was all punishment. Because deep down, she believed she had failed him. She should have written more. She should have answered his last email sooner. She should have said the words she'd always held back, "Come home safe. I need you." Instead, she wore her guilt like a second skin. The tattoo came later. A small shop on the edge of town, the buzz of the needle loud in her ears, the smell of ink sharp in her nose. She had chosen dog tags because they felt more real than flowers or dates carved in stone. She wanted permanence. She wanted the weight of his name etched into her arm so she could never run from it. Every morning, every night she saw it. She touched it, and she remembered. But remembering came with anger too. Anger at the world that took him. Anger at the recruiters who had promised adventure but delivered a coffin. Anger at anyone in uniform, anyone who reminded her of the system that had swallowed her brother whole. That's why, when Thomas first sat in her section, she couldn't hide the coldness in her eyes. She didn't know him, didn't care who he was. All she saw was the ghost of her brother's world, the world that had taken him, and she hated him for it. But then came the coin. That coin had stopped her cold. She knew it immediately. Daniel had shown it to her once before he deployed, flipping it across his knuckles with a grin. His unit's challenge coin. His lucky charm, he'd called it. She had forgotten about it until the moment Thomas laid it gently on her table like a prayer. Her throat had gone tight. Her hands trembled. And for the first time in years, she felt something she hadn't let herself feel: connection. Now every time Thomas came back, she found herself caught between suspicion and need. She wanted to know everything about him, about how he had known Daniel, what they had been through together. But she was afraid too. Afraid of hearing things that would break her further. Afraid of opening wounds she had worked so hard to scar over. Tonight was no different. She watched him from behind the counter, the way he sat quietly, hands folded, eyes distant. He wasn't like the other veterans who sometimes came through, loud, boasting, eager to tell war stories to anyone who would listen. No, Thomas was different. His silence wasn't empty. It was weighted, heavy with things unsaid. When she finally approached his booth, coffee pot in hand, she found herself asking a question she hadn't planned. What was he like? Thomas blinked, pulled from his thoughts. For a moment he didn't answer. She thought maybe he hadn't heard. But then he said quietly he was steady, reliable, the kind of man you trusted without needing to ask why. Her chest tightened. That was Daniel, her Daniel. She sat down across from him, uninvited, coffee pot still in her hands. He always looked out for me, even when I didn't want him to. He annoy me with it, hovering, checking in, lecturing me about the smallest things. Thomas allowed the smallest of smiles. Sounds about right. Her voice wavered. And then one day he was just gone, and I didn't get to say goodbye. Thomas wanted to reach across the table to tell her Daniel's last words, to give her the closure she craved. But his throat closed. He wasn't ready. Not yet. Instead, he said softly, he thought about you out there. Her eyes brimmed with tears. She set the coffee pot down, gripping it with white knuckles. Then why didn't he come home? Thomas had no answer, none that could ease her pain. War doesn't give answers, it only leaves scars. The silence between them stretched, but it wasn't hostile anymore. It was the kind of silence that came when two people stood at the edge of the same cliff, staring into the same void. Finally, she whispered, "I don't even know your name." "Thomas," he said. She nodded slowly, as if committing it to memory. "I'm." The name hung between them, fragile, almost sacred. For the first time since Daniel's death, she had spoken her name to someone connected to him. For the first time, Thomas had allowed himself to bridge the chasm between his silence and her grief. Neither of them said it aloud, but they both felt it. Something had begun. Something fragile, something painful, but something real. And in that quiet diner, beneath the hum of neon lights and the clatter of dishes, two broken lives shifted, just slightly, toward healing. Why had he kept it from her for so long? Thomas sat in the booth, staring at the photograph between them. Daniel's smile, frozen in time, stared back at him from the faded paper. His hand rested near it, her fingers trembling as if afraid the picture might vanish if she touched it too hard. She had asked the question he had dreaded since the first moment he saw the tattoo. What happened to him? Her voice had cracked when she asked it, and Thomas felt the weight of every mile he had carried that silence. He had always told himself it was mercy, keeping the story locked away, that if she never knew the details, she could hold on to some gentler version of Daniel's last moments. But now he saw the truth in her eyes. The not knowing was its own kind of wound. Thomas took a slow breath. The diner buzzed faintly around them, but it felt miles away. He looked not at her tattoo, not at the coin still resting in his wallet, but at her, Daniel's sister, the one who deserved to know. "It was supposed to be simple," he began, his voice low, graveled with memory. Leaned forward, eyes locked on his. "We were sent into a village just after dawn. They told us it would be quick, in and out." His jaw tightened. "But it never is, not really." Swallowed, her nails dug into the edge of the table. "There was an explosion," Thomas continued. "IED. Took out the road in front of us, dust, smoke, everything chaos. We took fire from rooftops, men scrambling, civilians screaming, kids crying. Daniel," his voice faltered for the first time, and he pressed his hand against the table as if steadying himself. Daniel didn't hesitate. He was pulling people out, dragging a private who was pinned down. He was. His lips parted, a quiet sob escaping before she could stop it. "He was hit," Thomas said softly. "I got to him as fast as I could, tried to stop the bleeding. I carried him behind cover, but," he exhaled shakily, "there wasn't enough time." Shook her head, tears sliding down her cheeks. "No, no, he was strong, he would fought." "He did," Thomas said quickly, leaning forward. "He fought harder than anyone I've ever seen. But sometimes it doesn't matter how strong you are. Sometimes the world," his voice broke and he looked down, "the world doesn't care." Pressed her palms to her face, shoulders shaking. Thomas wanted to stop there, wanted to let the story end, let her believe Daniel's last moments were silent. But the truth pressed harder against his chest, demanding release. "He said something," Thomas whispered. His hands dropped, her tear-streaked eyes snapped to his. "What did he say?" Thomas hesitated. His throat tightened. He had held these words inside for years, afraid of them, afraid of what they meant, afraid of giving them to her. But now he couldn't hold them anymore. "He said, tell my sister," Thomas's voice cracked. And then he was gone, he didn't get to finish. Stared at him silent, her whole body trembling. "That's all," she finally whispered, her voice breaking. "That's all he said." Thomas nodded slowly. "That's all I could hear. I've carried it every day since, wondering what he wanted me to tell you, wondering if I failed him by not knowing." Pressed her hand to her mouth, a choked sound escaping her. The tattoo on her arm seemed to burn under her skin, the ink of Daniel's name heavier than ever. "I thought," she said between sobs, "I thought he died alone." Thomas shook his head firmly. "No, he wasn't alone. I was there. I held his hand. I promised him I'd look after his family." His voice broke again. "I should found you sooner. I should told you years ago." His face crumpled, torn between grief and relief. The diner faded around them. The clink of dishes, the murmur of other customers, the hum of neon, all of it disappeared beneath the raw weight of the moment. Two people, bound by the same ghost, sitting across from each other with nothing but truth and silence between them. Reached for the photograph again, her fingers tracing Daniel's smile. "He was always looking out for me," she whispered. "Even then, even when he didn't get to finish his sentence." Thomas closed his eyes. Her words were a knife and a balm all at once. For years he had carried the memory of Daniel's death as failure, a mission gone wrong, a brother lost on his watch. But now, hearing her voice tremble as she clung to the fragment of Daniel's last words, he realized something else. It wasn't failure, it was a handoff. Daniel's last breath hadn't been wasted, it had been given, passed from him to Thomas, from Thomas to a chain unbroken even through death. But the guilt remained. Thomas opened his eyes, staring at the steam rising from his untouched coffee. "I couldn't save him," he said quietly, "and that's something I'll never forgive myself for." Wiped her cheeks, her voice steadier now. "You stayed with him, that's what matters. He didn't die alone, he had you." Thomas looked at her, really looked, and for the first time in years, the shadow in his eyes lifted just slightly. They sat there for what felt like hours, not speaking, not moving, just sharing the weight of memory. When finally stood, her legs shaky, she placed her hand over her tattoo, fingers pressing against the ink. Then, with her other hand, she slid something across the table toward him. A small, worn bracelet, simple leather frayed at the edges. "He gave this to me before he left," she said softly. "Said it was his good luck charm. I couldn't wear it anymore. It hurt too much." Her eyes glistened. "But maybe you should have it." Thomas's chest tightened. He picked it up gently, running his fingers over the worn leather, feeling the imprint of years. "I don't know if I deserve it," he admitted. "Maybe," said her voice trembling but sure, "it's not about deserving. Maybe it's about remembering." Thomas nodded slowly, the bracelet heavy in his hand, heavier than any metal he had ever been given. And in that quiet booth beneath the dim light of the diner, something shifted again. Grief didn't vanish, guilt didn't fade, but connection rooted deeper. Two lives bound by silence, now bound by memory. And sometimes, memory was enough to keep the dead alive. Why did he keep coming back? Thomas asked himself that every time he turned his truck into the cracked asphalt lot of the diner. He told himself it was just coincidence, just habit. But deep down, he knew better. Something in him couldn't stay away. It wasn't about the food. He rarely touched it. It wasn't about the coffee either, bitter and thin as it was. It was about her. She didn't smile when she saw him walk through the door. Not the way she did for others. But her eyes softened just slightly, like she was bracing herself less each time. That tiny shift was enough to keep him coming back. For years, Thomas had lived with silence as his closest companion. It had been safer that way. People didn't want to hear what he carried, and he didn't want to share it. But now, every time he sat across from, every time she asked him about Daniel or let a piece of her own story slip, that silence cracked a little more. Still, trust was fragile. One evening, she slid into the booth across from him again, apron crumpled from the long shift, exhaustion in her eyes. She didn't ask if he minded. She just sat, exhaling sharply as if she had been holding her breath all day. "You ever wonder what it's all for?" she asked suddenly, voice flat. Thomas tilted his head. "What do you mean?" "My brother, your service, the war, all of it." Her fingers traced the edge of her notepad. "They tell us it's for freedom, for country. but all I see is a folded flag in my mom's living room and a chair that's never filled at the table. Thomas's jaw tightened. He asked himself the same question more times than he could count, but hearing it from her, raw and unguarded, made it cut deeper. He sipped his coffee before answering. Sometimes it wasn't about the big picture. Sometimes it was just about the man next to you, keeping him alive. That was enough. Her eyes glistened, but you couldn't keep him alive. The words were harsh but not cruel, honest. Thomas flinched, but he didn't look away. No, I couldn't. The silence stretched between them, heavy with things neither wanted to face. But then's expression softened. I'm sorry, that wasn't fair. Thomas shook his head. It's the truth, and I live with it every day. She leaned back, staring at the ceiling. I live with it too. Different way, I guess. People look at me and see a waitress, but underneath, all I am is someone's sister who didn't make it back. Her words hung in the air, raw and painful. Thomas had no response. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out the bracelet she had given him. The worn leather loop rested in his palm. I've been carrying this, he said quietly. Feels like he's still here when I touch it. His lips trembled. She reached across the table, fingertips brushing the bracelet. I couldn't. It hurt too much. But maybe you're stronger than me. Thomas shook his head. No, just different kinds of broken. For the first time, she let out a small laugh. It was shaky, fragile, but real. Different kinds of broken, I like that. They sat like that for a long time. Two people bound by the same ghost, neither whole, neither healed, but no longer completely alone. Days turned into weeks. Thomas found himself timing his visits to her shifts, though he never admitted it aloud. Began sitting with him more often, sometimes just for a minute, sometimes for the length of her break. She would tell him stories about Daniel from when they were kids, the time he built her that collapsed a week later, the way he'd sneak her candy even when their mother said no, the way he'd ruffle her hair and call her kiddo, even when she begged him to stop. Thomas listened, really listened. He hadn't allowed himself to remember Daniel as anything other than a soldier, a comrade lost in the dirt of battle. But through stories, Daniel came alive again, not just Corporal Price, not just the man who bled out in his arms, but a brother, a son, a boy who once laughed so hard he spilled soda all over the couch. It hurt, God, it hurt, but it also healed. One night after closing, and Thomas walked out together into the cool night air. The diner lights flickered behind them, the highway humming in the distance. She hugged her arms around herself. You know, I used to hate you. Thomas raised an eyebrow. I figured. I saw you walk in the first time and I thought you're one of them. One of the men who got my brother killed. And I hated you for existing when he didn't. She glanced at him, guilt flashing in her eyes. But then you put that coin on the table and I realized you'd been carrying him too. Thomas's throat tightened. He shoved his hands into his jacket pockets. Hate's easier than hurt. I know that better than anyone. Nodded slowly. Maybe, but I don't hate you anymore. The words hit him harder than he expected. He hadn't realized how much he needed to hear them until now. They stood in silence for a while, the night stretching around them. Finally asked, Why do you keep coming back here, Thomas? He considered lying, saying it was just on his way, just a habit, but he couldn't, not to her. Because when I'm here, it feels like Daniel isn't gone. Her breath caught, she didn't answer right away. Then she whispered, Me too. They shared a look, fragile and unspoken, and for the first time, Thomas felt something stir inside him he hadn't felt in years. Not hope exactly, but the faint outline of it. The road ahead was long. The grief would never fully leave. The guilt would never completely fade. But maybe, just maybe, neither of them had to carry it alone anymore. And sometimes that was enough. Why did her voice suddenly sound like a blade? The diner was half empty that night, the kind of quiet evening when the only sounds were the low murmur of the radio and the clatter of silverware. Thomas sat in his booth, coffee cooling in front of him. was restless, packing between tables with more force than usual, her jaw tight, her shoulders stiff. When she finally came over, she didn't sit. She stood above him, fists clenched at her sides. "You knew him better in those last months than I did." Her words came fast, sharp. "You fought beside him, ate beside him, slept in the same dirt, and her voice cracked. "I only got phone calls, emails, a Christmas card." Thomas looked up at her, his throat tight. "No," she snapped. "Do me. You've been walking around with his last words in your head for years, and I didn't even know. Do you have any idea how that feels? Knowing a stranger has more of my brother than I do." The anger in her eyes wasn't just anger. It was grief, sharpened until it cut everything in its path. Thomas swallowed hard. "I didn't tell you because I didn't want to hurt you." She leaned in, her voice low and trembling. "You didn't tell me because you were a coward." The word landed heavy, but he didn't flinch, because maybe she was right. He stared into his coffee, his hands steady but his heart pounding. "I've lived with that day every second since it happened. Every time I close my eyes, I see him bleeding out in my arms. I hear him trying to speak. I feel his hand go slack, and I couldn't stop it." His voice grew rougher. "So yeah, maybe I am a coward, because telling you means admitting all over again that I failed him." His breath caught. The edge in her expression faltered, replaced by something softer, though no less painful. "You didn't fail him," she said, but the words sounded uncertain, like she was trying to convince herself too. Thomas shook his head. "I was supposed to bring him home. That was the job, and I didn't." The silence that followed was heavy, pressing against both of them. Finally slid into the booth across from him, her anger giving way to exhaustion. She rubbed her temples, her voice barely a whisper. "I hate them, you know, the uniforms, the officers, the speeches about sacrifice and honor. They dress it all up like it's noble, but none of that brought him back. None of that sat with my mom when she cried herself to sleep. None of that stood at the grave in the rain." Her eyes burned into his. "And sometimes I hate you too, because you remind me of all of it." Thomas didn't move, didn't argue. He let the words pierce him because he knew they were true in their own way. "I get it," he said finally. "You have every right to hate me." Her hands curled into fists on the table. "Then why do I keep sitting here with you? Why do I keep listening?" Thomas exhaled, slow and heavy. "Because we're both carrying him, and maybe we don't know how to set him down." His eyes filled with tears, but she didn't look away. She wanted to be angry. She wanted to blame him. But beneath it all, she wanted to understand. She leaned back, folding her arms. "You said he tried to say something to me, that he didn't finish. Do you ever wonder what he wanted to tell me?" "All the time," Thomas admitted. "And—" He hesitated, then met her gaze. "And I think it doesn't matter what the words were. What mattered is that in his last breath he was thinking of you. That's the truth I carry." His lips trembled. She looked away, blinking fast, as if fighting back the wave rising in her chest. "Sometimes I dream about him. I dream he walks through the door, sits at the counter, orders pancakes like nothing ever happened. And I wake up, and it's still just me." Thomas's voice softened. "I dream about him too. Only in mine I can never reach him. He's always ahead of me, disappearing into the dust." Their eyes met again, two broken visions colliding in the same dim light. For a long moment, neither spoke. The tension between them wasn't just conflict, it was survival. Two people trying to claw their way through grief, colliding because grief didn't leave room for clean edges. Finally whispered, "I don't know if I can forgive the military. I don't know if I can forgive you." Thomas nodded slowly. "You don't have to." The words startled her. She blinked as if waiting for him to take them back, to beg for forgiveness he didn't deserve. But he didn't. "I'm not here for that," Thomas said. "I'm here because your brother mattered, because he still matters. And whether you hate me or not, I'll keep showing up, because some promises don't die." Stared at him, her chest rising and falling, her tears catching in the neon light. And for the first time she saw it. the raw honesty in his face, the burden he carried not as pride but as penance. The silence that followed wasn't easy. It wasn't healing, but it was real. And sometimes real was the only ground worth standing on. She finally stood, grabbing the coffee pot, steadying her hands. "Your coffee's cold." Thomas almost smiled. "That's all right, so am I." She rolled her eyes, but her lips curved the slightest bit as she turned away. And in that moment, the conflict between them wasn't gone, but it had become something else, not an ending but a beginning. Because sometimes broken pieces don't fit neatly. They cut, they bruise, but when they press together, they still hold. Why did goodbyes always feel unfinished? Thomas asked himself that as he sat once more in the corner booth, the same cracked leather seat, the same chipped table, the same bitter coffee steaming faintly in front of him. But this time felt different. The silence around him wasn't suffocating. It wasn't empty. It was alive with memory. Moved through the diner, her motions calmer now. The weight in her shoulders was still there, but it no longer pressed her into the ground. When she finally walked over, she didn't carry her notepad or the coffee pot. She just came and sat across from him, folding her hands on the table. For a long time, neither spoke, and yet everything was being said. "You know," she began softly, "I used to think grief was supposed to end. Like there was a finish line. You cry, you scream, you break, and then one day you wake up and you're healed. But it doesn't work like that." Thomas nodded slowly. "No, it doesn't. It's like carrying a stone. Some days it's heavier. Some days you almost forget it's there, but it never leaves your hands." Her gaze met his. "You've been carrying it too, haven't you?" Thomas looked down at the bracelet in his palm, the leather worn thin, frayed from years of Daniel's touch before it passed into hers and now into his. He closed his fingers around it. "Every damn day." His voice trembled, but it didn't break. "Then maybe we don't have to carry it alone anymore." The words lingered in the air, fragile, like something that could vanish if either of them moved too quickly. Thomas swallowed hard. He had lived so long in silence, convinced that sharing the weight would make it heavier. But looking at now, he realized the opposite was true. Memory shared was memory honored. Pain spoken was pain divided. He leaned back, exhaling slowly. "Your brother would like that, us sitting here still remembering him." A small smile touched her lips. "He'd probably tease us, tell us to stop being so dramatic." Thomas chuckled, the sound rough but genuine. "Yeah, he would." They fell quiet again, but it was a comfortable quiet, the kind that comes when words are no longer necessary. Later that night, after the diner closed, they walked outside together. The neon sign buzzed faintly above the door, casting the parking lot in a pinkish glow. The highway stretched dark and endless, headlights sweeping past every so often. Hugged her arms around herself, the autumn air crisp and cool. "Do you ever wonder why him?" she asked suddenly. "Every day," Thomas admitted. "I used to think if I could find a reason it would hurt less, but there isn't one, is there? Not really." Thomas shook his head. "War doesn't care about reasons, it just takes." Nodded slowly, staring at the road. "Then maybe the only thing left is what we give back, the stories, the memories, the way we keep them alive." Thomas studied her for a moment, her face lit faintly by the glow of the sign. Daniel's steadiness was in her, he realized. Different form, same root. A quiet strength that endured even through the cracks. "You're right," he said. "That's all we can do." They stood there a while longer, saying nothing. The night wrapped around them, heavy but not crushing. Finally, Thomas reached into his wallet and pulled out the challenge coin. He turned it over in his palm, the metal warm from years of being held. "I've carried this long enough," he said, holding it out to her. His eyes widened. "No, that's yours." "It was his," Thomas corrected gently, "and it belongs with you." Her hand shook as she took it, fingers curling tight around the coin. Tears welled in her eyes, but her smile was steady. "Thank you." Thomas nodded, his throat too tight for words. They didn't hug. They didn't need to. Some bonds didn't need grand gestures. Some bonds lived in silence, in the simple act of showing up. When Thomas climbed into his truck, he glanced back through the windshield. Stood by the diner door, her hand pressed over her tattoo, the coin clutched to her chest. She didn't wave. She didn't call out. She just gave him a small nod, the same nod she had given him that first day. And it was enough. As he drove off into the night, Thomas felt something he hadn't felt in years. Not joy, not peace, but a quiet dignity. The kind that doesn't shout, doesn't demand, doesn't beg. The kind that lives in silence and action. He thought of Daniel, his laugh, his steadiness, his last words unfinished. He thought of her grief, her anger, her resilience. And he thought of himself, a man who had spent years running from promises, finally learning that some promises weren't meant to be solved. They were meant to be carried together. The road stretched on, dark and endless. But for the first time, Thomas didn't feel lost on it. Because sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts. And sometimes, the deepest connections are born not from the words we say, but from the silence we choose to share.